It is dawn on the east bank of the Berezina River at Berezino in the last days of June 1944 in the centre of Belorussia. Behind you the road runs back to the east for something close to 37 miles, and every foot of it is occupied. Horse-drawn artillery, staff cars, ammunition wagons, half-tracks and assault guns are stacked 3 abreast, and nothing has moved for hours. Ahead of you is the only bridge. You hear the aircraft before you see them, and then the span across the water takes a direct hit and comes apart. On the far side is the road to Minsk. On this side are the divisions of the German Fourth Army, and from this moment forward there is no organised way across. The Fourth Army was not a weak formation when that bridge came down. It was one of the senior field armies of Army Group Centre, and it had held the ground east of Minsk for the better part of 2 years. On the 22nd of June 1944, it counted roughly 165,000 men, organised into 4 corps. The 27th Army Corps held the sector around Orsha. The 39th Panzer Corps held the ground toward Mogilev with 4 of the army's best divisions. The 12th Army Corps sat in the centre. The 53rd Corps was held in reserve. Command of the whole had passed only weeks earlier. Generaloberst Gotthard Heinrici, who had run the army through the defensive fighting of the previous winter, fell ill and left on the 4th of June. General de Infanterie Kurt von Tippelskirch took temporary command of the army 18 days before the Soviet offensive opened. 12 days from the opening of the offensive on the 22nd of June to the sealing of the ring on the 3rd of July 1944, the Fourth Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. By the 8th of July, its commander was dictating an order to lay down arms into a Soviet typewriter. The first thing that has to be understood about the destruction of the Fourth Army is that a great deal of it was arranged in Berlin months before a Soviet gun fired. Hitler issued the fortified place order. Towns across the Eastern Front, Minsk among them, were designated strongpoints to be held at all costs. The idea behind the order was that these places would act as breakwaters. A Soviet offensive would flow around them, the garrisons would tie down attacking divisions, and a later counter-offensive would relieve them. That counter-offensive was never mounted anywhere. What the order actually did was remove mobility from the German command. Formations were pinned to forward positions and could not be repositioned without authorization from above, and authorization did not come. Minsk itself was never a fortress in any military sense. It was a rail and road hub with warehouses and workshops, a logistics centre rather than a defensive position. The order to hold it as a strongpoint fixed the Fourth Army's whole rearward planning to a town that most of its divisions would never reach. When the offensive came, the army was not permitted to conduct a mobile defence. It was permitted to hold, and then it was permitted to retreat only when the retreat had already become impossible. The second arrangement was made on the ground, at night, by people wearing no uniform anyone in Berlin recognised. On the night of the 19th to the 20th of June, Belarusian partisans set off roughly 10,500 explosive charges in a single coordinated operation along the rail lines running from the Dnieper to Minsk. This was not harassment. It was a systematic strike against a specific system. Rail bridges, telegraph lines and junctions were hit together. The junction at Molodechno among them, and the German rail network in Belorussia stopped functioning for about 48 hours at the exact moment it was needed most. The effect on the Fourth Army was immediate, and it never lifted. Supply trains stopped. Reinforcement movement stopped. The 3rd Panzer Army on the northern flank was cut off from coordination with the 4th, so the 2 neighbouring armies fought their opening days without a shared picture of the front. Trucks that did reach the forward divisions arrived late and partly loaded. Within days of the offensive opening, German infantry divisions in the sector were rationing ammunition and fuel, and when the retreat began, it was forced onto roads instead of rails because the rails were gone. Roads are visible from the air. That single consequence, more than any tactical decision made in the following 2 weeks, determined how the Fourth Army died. Operation Bagration opened on the 22nd of June 1944, on the 3rd anniversary of the German invasion. 4 Soviet fronts attacked along the whole length of Army Group Centre. The offensive is a story in its own right, and it is not this one. What matters here is what it did to one army. Within days, the Soviet breakthroughs on either side of the Fourth Army had gone deeper than its flanks could follow, and the formation holding the centre found both its shoulders open. On the 25th of June, Tipolskirch's divisions began pulling back westward toward the Berezina, into a corridor that was already narrowing behind them. The Berezina is not an impressive river. It is the crossing point that mattered, and there were very few of them. The main one was the bridge at Berezino, and the approach roads to it filled with a single column that stretched back roughly 37 miles. Horse teams, motor transport, assault guns and tanks moved onto the same road surface at the same time because there was no other surface to use. Marshland lay on either side. The column moved at the pace of its slowest wagon, and frequently it did not move at all. Then the air arrived. The 4th and 16th Air Armies flew over the retreat almost without opposition. The Luftwaffe was largely absent from the sector, grounded by fuel shortages, or unwilling to operate in large formations against Soviet fighter strength, and its absence was total enough that German ground units stopped expecting cover at all. Soviet medium bombers put up 1,000 sorties on the night before the main assault. Through the retreat, Ilyushin ground attack aircraft worked the roads continuously in daylight. 1,744 of these aircraft were committed across Bagration as a whole, and in the Berezina sector they had a target that could not disperse, could not shoot back with any effect, and could not leave the road. The tactical consequence was precise, and it was fatal. Daylight movement became impossible. German columns halted at dawn, dispersed into whatever cover existed, and moved again after dark. That cut the speed of the retreat roughly in half. An army withdrawing at half speed toward a river with one bridge, pursued by tank armies moving at full speed on open ground, is an army that will be caught, and the arithmetic of it was visible to both sides by the 27th of June. The command structure went first. General de Infanterie Robert Martinek, commanding the 39th Panzer Corps, died on the 28th of June during the withdrawal. His replacement, Generalleutnant Otto Schönemann, died on the 29th. Two corps commanders lost on consecutive days in the same sector from the same cause. Generalleutnant Dietrich von Sorcken took over what was left of the corps and led its remnants in the breakout attempts that followed. By that point, the 39th Panzer Corps, which had begun the offensive with 4 of the army's strongest divisions, had largely disintegrated at the crossings. Most of its units never reached the encirclement at all, because they were destroyed before they got that far. In the last days of June 1944, Soviet air attacks struck the Berezina crossings at Berezino, and the crossing points became the choke point of the retreat. What followed was improvisation under continuous air attack. Ferries, rafts and emergency crossings were assembled on the eastern bank, while the column behind them continued to grow. Equipment that could not be floated was abandoned where it stood. Heavy artillery, transport and armoured vehicles were left on the east bank in numbers no German record ever fully counted, because the staffs that would have counted them were themselves inside the pocket within days. The scale of what was left behind is easier to state than to count. The Fourth Army lost effectively all of its organic heavy equipment in the course of the withdrawal and the encirclement. Hundreds of tanks and assault guns were destroyed or abandoned at the crossings and inside the ring. Thousands of artillery pieces were left in position or on the road, and a large proportion of them were recovered intact by Soviet units. The column on the Berezino road contained tens of thousands of horse-drawn wagons and motor vehicles, and almost none of them crossed. Around 100,000 rifles and carbines passed out of German hands with the men carrying them. No separate inventory exists for the pocket alone. For the same reason, no separate casualty return exists. The quartermasters who would have written it went into captivity with everyone else. The destruction was not confined to one river line. The 12th Infantry Division was encircled and destroyed at Mogilev before the main pocket ever formed, which removed a formation the 39th Panzer Corps was counting on to cover its southern shoulder during the withdrawal. The pattern through the last week of June is consistent, divisions being taken individually at towns and crossings, each loss making the next one easier, and each one narrowing the corridor through which the rest of the army was trying to move. On the 29th of June, the flanking fortress towns fell to Soviet mobile forces. Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev and Bobruisk were taken in succession, and the Bobruisk pocket was eliminated. Soviet armour converged from north and south, closing the corridor around the Fourth Army's retreat, but the ring east of Minsk had not yet sealed. The closing was the work of armour moving faster than the German command could report. On the 1st of July, the 5th Guards Tank Army crossed the Berezina at Borisov alongside the 11th Guards Army. German engineers demolished the Berezina bridges at Borisov on the 30th of June 1944 to deny the crossing to Soviet forces and pulled back. Without that hold, the ring would have shut hours earlier and taken more of the army with it. It is one of the few German tactical decisions in the whole sequence that measurably changed an outcome. The 5th Panzer Division did not survive its own achievement. A German panzer division was thrown across the approaches to Minsk and could not hold the weight of the Soviet tank army, losing most of its remaining tanks. That engagement removed the last mobile armoured formation capable of interfering with the Soviet advance on Minsk. After that, there was nothing in the sector that could counterattack a Soviet tank corps, and the encirclement stopped being a race and became a schedule. Minsk fell on the 3rd of July. 2 tank corps took it from opposite directions. General Badini's 2nd Guards Tank Corps, working under the 3rd Belarusian Front, broke into the city in the early hours of the morning. The 4th Guards Tank Brigade of the Corps first through the streets. By midday, General Panov's 1st Guards Tank Corps, coming up from the 1st Belarusian Front, entered from the southeast. The two formations linked up inside the city that afternoon. General Shafranov's 31st Army came into the fighting the same day. The Belarusian capital, held by the Germans since the summer of 1941, was liberated in a single day of street fighting, and it was liberated from both sides at once. The following day, General Batov's 65th Army and Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army closed their pincers beyond Minsk and completed the encirclement of the 4th Army trapped in the country east of the city, cutting all remaining routes to the northwest. The ring was now continuous. Inside it were approximately 100,000 to 105,000 German troops. It is worth being exact about what that number describes, because it is often reported carelessly. That figure is not the Fourth Army alone. It is the Fourth Army which made up the great bulk of it, together with the remnants of the Ninth Army that had been driven north out of the fighting around Bobruisk. The pocket east of Minsk was a mixed formation of 2 shattered armies, and the 4th was the larger part of it. The men inside had no army commander. Tippelskirch had gotten out before the ring closed, and he got out alone, in the sense that mattered. He survived the war, was taken by British forces in 1945, released in 1947, and lived until 1957. His escape meant that, at the moment the encirclement became final, the Fourth Army had no head. There was no one inside with the authority to command the whole, and no communication with anyone outside who could grant it. On the 3rd of July, that authority was picked up by General de Infanterie Vincenz Müller. Müller commanded the 12th Army Corps, which he had taken over only weeks earlier in June, and his corps was the largest and most cohesive body still in the pocket. Roughly 6 divisions with much of their organisation intact. With Tippelskirch gone, Müller assumed acting command of the encircled Fourth Army. He inherited a formation with no supply line, no air cover, no relief force being assembled anywhere, and no permission to do the only thing left that made military sense. The geography inside the ring was as hostile as the forces around it. The pocket lay in the forest and marsh country east of Minsk, ground that had been under partisan control in large stretches for 2 years. Units attempting to break out west found the roads through the Naliboki forest country blocked and ambushed. Soviet armour sealed the open ground. Soviet aircraft worked anything that moved in daylight. Partisan detachments held the tracks through the woods. A German unit inside the pocket could be stopped by any one of 3 separate forces, and to get out it had to pass all 3 at once. The reduction of the pocket took the first week of July, and it worked from the outside in. Divisional and corps commanders were taken in sequence as their formations lost cohesion. A German divisional commander was taken prisoner near Cherven, east of Minsk, as the last organised groups were rounded up. General Adolf Trowitz of the 57th Infantry Division was taken between the 6th and the 9th. General de Infanterie Paul Volkers, commanding the 27th Army Corps, whose divisions had retreated all the way from Orsha and were trapped in the area of Pekalin, was captured in the encirclement. General de Infanterie Friedrich Gollwitzer of the 53rd Corps was taken in the encirclement as well. These were not isolated losses of individual officers. They were the sequential removal of every level of command above the battalion. On the 8th of July, Müller attempted a breakout with the 18th Panzer Grenadier Division and was captured. What he did in the hours after his capture is the reason this operation is remembered differently from the other pockets of that summer. Müller dictated a written order to cease resistance. He dictated it to a fellow German prisoner, who typed it on a German typewriter. The Soviets printed it, dropped it over the pocket as leaflets from aircraft, and broadcast it through loudspeakers to the units still holding out in the forests. The order instructed all encircled German troops to stop fighting and lay down their arms. Two things about that order need to be said plainly, because the record supports both, and they are usually separated for convenience. The first is that the order was genuine. It was not a Soviet fabrication, and it was not a text signed under duress and disowned afterwards. Müller described dictating it in his own later account, and he described it as his decision. The second is that the Soviets then used it as a weapon, which is exactly what it was. They printed it, distributed it by air, amplified it over loudspeakers and publicized it afterwards. Both halves are true. A German general's authentic order to surrender, delivered by Soviet aircraft to the men who still recognized his authority, is one of the more effective pieces of battlefield persuasion of the war precisely because it was not a forgery. The order did not reach everyone. Radio communication inside the pocket had broken down. Units were scattered across forest ground in fragments, and some groups either never received the leaflets or did not believe them. Müller issued a second order to ensure it reached the units the first attempt had missed. Organised resistance in the pocket collapsed on the 8th of July with Müller's capture and his order. Isolated groups continued to hold out through the 9th, 10th and 11th, and the pocket was declared liquidated on the 11th of July. Soviet clearing operations and partisan sweeps through the forest ground ran until that same day. The reduction of the encircled forces took 9 days, from the moment the ring closed until liquidation was declared on the 11th. The outer offensive, from Bagration's opening on the 22nd of June to the moment both Soviet tank corps converged at Minsk, lasted exactly 12 days. From beginning to end, the Fourth Army's existence as a fighting formation is measured in days, not weeks. The numbers deserve care, because this is a battle where several different figures are all correct and describe different things. Approximately 40,000 German troops died inside the Minsk pocket. That figure appears in Soviet reporting, and it also survives cross-checking against German archival material, which is why modern historians do not dispute it. It is the best supported specific figure attached to the pocket itself, and it is not one of the inflated ones. Between 60,000 and 70,000 were captured. Here, two Soviet numbers circulate, and they are counted differently. Soviet reporting after the mopping up of the 11th of July gives 35,000 prisoners, which is the count of organised surrender at the end. The larger figure covers everyone taken over the full 12 days, including the men picked up in fragments through the first week. Both are defensible. They are answering different questions. Then there is the Fourth Army's own casualty return, and this is where careless reporting does the most damage. The army lost approximately 130,000 men out of the 165,000 it started with, roughly 79% of its strength. The German breakdown gives 16,870 wounded, 5,315 dead, and 108,485 missing. That last category is the one that tells the story. Over 80% of the loss was men whose fate the German army could not account for, because the staffs that would have accounted for them were captured. But that 130,000 is the army's total loss across the whole operation, from the 22nd of June onward. It is not the pocket's casualty figure. Conflating the two produces a number that is too large for the encirclement and too small for the campaign. The same discipline applies to the wider operation. Soviet official figures for the whole Belarusian offensive claim 381,000 German dead and 158,000 captured. Western historians working from German archives give a total of roughly 400,000 to 450,000 casualties of all categories: dead, wounded, missing, and captured together. The Soviet figures are inflated in the fatal category by something in the range of 10 to 20%, and they sometimes count wounded within totals presented as losses. This does not make the victory smaller. The German army group in Belorussia was destroyed either way. It means the honest number is the archival one, and there is no reason to reach for the propaganda figure when the real one is already the largest German defeat of the war. One more claim should be handled carefully. Various accounts state that only a few hundred men out of some thousands got out of the pocket to German lines. Those figures have no firm sourcing behind them, and they vary widely between accounts. Reliable numbers exist for the dead, the captured, and the missing. They do not exist for the escapers, and a specific escape figure presented with confidence is a figure someone has estimated rather than counted. There is a reason so much of the pocket's detail has to be reconstructed from the outside. Very few German eyewitness accounts of the Minsk encirclement survive, because the officers who would have written them were captured or died inside it. What exists comes from a short list: Müller's own statements about the breakout and the surrender order, Tippelskirch's account of getting out before the ring closed, and fragmentary reports from junior officers who reached German lines. Against that, the Soviet side of the record is comparatively rich, because the Soviet side had staffs, cameras, and correspondents present throughout. Any account of this pocket is therefore built mostly from the perspective of the force that won it, and that is worth knowing when a figure looks unusually clean. On the 17th of July 1944, 57,600 German prisoners were marched through the streets of Moscow. The Soviets called the operation the Great Waltz. It is remembered as the Parade of the Vanquished. 19 generals walked at the head of the column, along with 6 colonels and 1,227 officers in total. The generals were made to wear full dress uniform with their decorations visible. Vincenz Müller led them. Behind him walked men from the pocket he had just ordered to surrender. Paul Voelkers of the 27th Corps was there. Friedrich Gollwitzer of the 53rd was there. So was Major General Adolf Heymann, the former commander of the Orsha garrison. The column took hours to pass through the city, watched by Moscow civilians and filmed by Soviet cameramen from fixed positions along the route. Street-washing vehicles followed behind the last ranks, which was a piece of theatre and was understood as one. The link between that parade and this pocket is direct, but it should be stated accurately. Soviet sources explicitly describe these prisoners as captured in the encirclement east of Minsk, and the Minsk pocket was the single largest source of them. But the 57,600 were selected from a larger prisoner population, taken by all 3 Belarusian fronts across the whole offensive, including the pockets at Vitebsk, Mogilev and Bobruisk. They were also selected for physical condition, chosen from men fit enough to march for hours. The parade was assembled to be looked at. It is a real record of a real defeat, and it is also a curated one. The purpose of it was not primarily domestic. Moscow had been receiving reports of enormous German losses for 2 years, and audiences abroad had learned to discount them. 57,000 prisoners walking through a capital city in daylight, in front of foreign correspondents, was evidence that could not be argued with. It was the point at which the destruction of Army Group Centre stopped being a claim in a communiqué and became a fact the world had watched. The Fourth Army was never reconstituted in any meaningful sense. A formation carrying the number was rebuilt under General Friedrich Hossbach in July and August of 1944, but it was a new organisation wearing an old designation, and it was never again capable of independent operations. Surviving personnel from the original army were absorbed into whatever depleted formations of Army Group Centre still had a headquarters, principally the 3rd Panzer Army and what remained of the 9th. The command structure that had held the ground east of Minsk since 1941 was disbanded by the simple fact that almost everyone in it was dead or in Soviet hands. Müller's later life is its own strange coda. He joined the National Committee for a Free Germany while in captivity, and became one of the more prominent German officers working with the Soviets. After the war, he returned to Germany and rose to become Deputy Defense Minister and Chief of Staff of the East German National People's Army. He died in 1961 after a fall from a balcony, officially recorded as suicide, and the circumstances have been argued over ever since. The 19 generals paraded through Moscow were held separately after the parade. Most of them did not return to Germany. Whether Müller was right to issue the order is still argued among German military historians, and the argument is not really about him. The fortified place order had already removed the option of a mobile defense. The partisan demolitions had already removed the supply system. Soviet air superiority had already halved the speed of the retreat. The loss of the Berezino bridge had already stripped the army of its heavy equipment. 2 tank corps had already taken Minsk from opposite directions, and a 3rd army had sealed the western wall. By the 8th of July, there was no military objective left inside the pocket that further resistance could achieve, and every road out was held by 3 different forces at once. Müller's order did not decide the battle. It ended a fight that had already been decided, and it is the reason a large number of men who were inside that forest in July 1944 came out of it. The Red Army did not defeat the German Fourth Army by outnumbering it at a single point. It defeated it by taking away, one at a time, everything the formation needed in order to be an army. The rail network went first in a single night, before the offensive even opened. The air over the retreat went next. The road speed went with it. The river crossing went on the 29th of June, and the equipment stayed on the wrong bank. The corps commanders went on consecutive days. The capital went on the 3rd of July. The western wall closed on the 4th, and on the 8th, the officer holding what was left of the command signed a piece of paper that Soviet aircraft scattered over the forest where his divisions were still hiding. 12 days saw it all: the opening assault, the partisan demolitions, the air campaign, the Berezina race, and Minsk's fall. 165,000 men at the start of the offensive, and roughly 130,000 of them gone by the end of it. An army that had held the eastern approaches to Minsk for 3 years, taken apart in the country it had occupied by the people who lived in it and the army that came back for them.